Well, hello everybody. Owen Sound Poet Laureate Richard-Yves Sitoski here with another practice of poetry video. And today we're going to be looking at my process. You got me a little early in the morning here, and I'll be getting into why that is as we go on. Okay, so my process always starts with a fairly rude awakening. It's always cat o'clock around here, which really means about 3:30 a.m. when Banjo Pitter Patterson requests being fed, rather vociferously, might I add. Once I've taken care of the beast, then comes time to write. And I find that early in the morning is the best time for me. My head is clear. I'm capable of concentrating. The cares and concerns of the day haven't taken over. It's nice and still and quiet in the house. I can do everything I need to do with just maybe one light on. So with a gray cat, black coffee, white pad, and a black pen, a Bic Gelosity 0.7 for preference. I'm all set to begin my day, and I usually just sit on the couch with that pad in my lap, and I just get started that way. There's nothing fancy about it. The easy work comes before any writing takes place, and that's reading. Read, read, read. You cannot write if you do not read. That's as simple as that. And I do so for about 3 hours. So from the tune of about 4 a.m. To 7 a.m. That's my best reading period. And I'll read a little bit of everything. I'll read poetry. I'll read fiction. I'll read books about poetry. Sometimes I'll read magazines and things like that. But it's usually books. So then the hard work begins. At about 7 o'clock, I have my second cup of coffee, and then I write nonstop also for a minimum of 3 hours. So I'm pretty much done by 10 a.m. and I'm exhausted at that point. It's time for breakfast because I've gone about 6 hours now without having eaten. So that does sort of weigh upon a person. But so far, so good. Seems to be working wonders for me. So what can this produce? So here are the results. This is what a sample page of my pad looks like. And we're going to follow here a poem from inception right to conclusion. This poem that I eventually wrote started with an observation that I'd written down amidst scraps of old poems and notes to self and things like that. And the observation was, like a record store in a building slated to be torn down for condos, loved with a love that can't save you. The inspiration for that came from a blog TO article on gentrification, and specifically on the possible demolition of a place called Sneaky Dee's, which is a famous Toronto dive restaurant, kind of like a Mexican kind of place, and how in these gentrified neighborhoods where the condos are going up, we're losing all these rustic, wonderful little places where there's truly life, where people live, where people experience one another, where people from all walks of life come together. And this was also kind of filtered a bit through Frank O'Hara, who's an American poet of the New York School in the 50s, who wrote a lot about the urban environment and sort of interspersed the personal observations about his own individual inner life with observations about the external world of the city. It's brilliant, brilliant stuff, and I urge you to get into him. And so what this did is this gave me the idea of using the notion of a building being torn down or a neighborhood being torn down as something that's symbolic of waste in a bad relationship, and how even love can't save you if there's lack of communication and if you're at cross purposes with one another. So the first draft sets up the situation. So that's in section 2 right down there. We have number 2. And that's basically where I put down the main thrust of the poem with the main idea of conformity to unreasonable expectations. It gets the ideas in their proper order. I tinker a little bit here and there with appropriate words and things like that, put some lines in, take them out, and so on and so forth. And I knew the animating idea of that condemned neighborhood or building would have to go at the end, and that the entire poem was going to lead up to that. And that's usually how my poems work. I often start with the ending of the poem and a snappy line, something pithy, something, aphoristic. And then the rest of the poem leads up to it, just cycles right into it. And I knew that that's what things would have to, that's definitely the approach that I was going to take with this one here. So the second draft comes in, that's number 3 at the top. It modifies the point of view. I had to figure out who is actually doing the cooking of the casseroles. Is it the person that the protagonist is living with, whose cooking isn't very good and who lives in a lackluster relationship, or is it actually the protagonist himself? Which, and by the way, this poem is actually loosely based on a relationship that I was involved in. So, and the person I was with couldn't cook, and I didn't know how to cook at the time either. So there's a bit of authenticity there. Made some expansion. So I took simple words as cook, and I increased them, I improved them to burnt. A little bit of specificity goes a long way in a poem. And I honed down the neighborhood into a record store. So that actually became what I stuck with, because neighborhood is kind of vague. A record store is very specific. It's a place that a lot of people love. A lot of people love vinyl shops. So do I. By the time I got to the third draft, I hit upon this really crazy scheme that I was going to use rhyme for this, because I noticed that subliminally, some of the words there were internal rhymes in some of the lines, and some of the lines at the end also had a bit of a rhyming sort of potential. So I thought I was going to do that. And of course, that made me think immediately what kind of rhythms I would use in the piece. The fourth draft gives us a further refinement. It includes the title, for example. I already started taking a lot more lines out and rewriting a lot of them, and sometimes putting them right back in. And then I had the even crazier notion that if I was going to rhyme it, well then darn it all, I'll make it into a sonnet, because depending on how I divvied up the lines, I'd have between 12 and 14. I thought, let's just go for a full 14 lines with a rhyming couplet at the end, and that'll turn it into a sonnet. So the fifth draft, that's the penultimate draft. This thing went through 6 drafts. It established the iambic and the trochaic interplay, and I'll get into that in another video where I analyze rhythm and rhyme, and I'll be using this poem to do so. So I'll put like a Randy Bachman, which he does at Vinyl Tap. He's always playing his own stuff, which is ridiculous, but anyway, I'll do the same thing with one of my pieces. Anyway, I worked out the 14 lines with the rhyming couplet at the end, and that brings us to the final result, which is the 6th draft, and the poem is called Gentrified. Heaven knows I occupied a role. I tried to cook, though I burnt the casseroles. Drove you about, though driving scares me. I followed your lead, watched game shows warily, in a room with no books to read. You kept me clean, white as a condo, in a part of town where all the pubs are coming down, the cafes, the bookstores, where what I truly love gets raised, like the record shop no love can save. So I hope you like that. And so stay tuned for the next video, which again, we'll pick up on where this leaves off, and we'll be looking at the rhythm and the rhyme in this poem. So as always, I'd like to thank David Medill, CFP of BMO Nesbitt Burns, and former library CEO Andrew Armitage for the generous support of the Poet Laureate program, and the Poet Laureate Advisory Committee and the Owen Sound and North Grey Union Public Library. And of course, I would like to acknowledge that this video was produced on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the Three Fires known as the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi Nations. I give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. All right, thanks a lot, and see you next time.